Hello and welcome to Thursday in Parliament. The main news from Westminster was a British terror suspect paid compensation after being held in Guantanamo Bay. And was the money used to fund terrorism? MPs want answers.
People across the country will feel sickened at the idea of large payments being made to someone who may have been involved in serious terrorist activity.
There are calls for an end to so-called witch hunts against soldiers who served in Northern Ireland.
It is wrong that our veterans are sitting at home wondering if perhaps a third or a fourth investigation is now going to take place into their case.
And calls for an investigation into claims that some peers turn up briefly to the House of Lords just to claim their £300 a day allowance.
This is taxpayers' money. Surely does the Leader of the House not agree that this at least warrants some sort of investigation about what's going on down there with their expenses?
But first, Jamal al-Harith, a British citizen, was held as a terror suspect in Guantanamo Bay in 2001 after the US forces seized him in Pakistan. He was released in 2004. The Daily Mail has claimed that the British government gave him £1 million in compensation. His family has denied the claim. Jamal al-Harith subsequently joined the so-called Islamic State group, and last week he carried out a suicide attack at an army base in Iraq. The Home Office was called to the Commons to make a statement on the case, but at the outset, a minister explained that there were a few things he couldn't talk about.
The monitoring of individuals is an intelligence matter, and the government does not and cannot comment on individual cases. Neither can the government comment on whether particular individuals have received compensation payments. In November 2010, the then Lord Chancellor, Secretary of State for Justice, my right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, informed the House of Commons that the government had secured a mediated settlement of the civil damages claims brought by detainees held at Guantanamo Bay in the early 2000s. The details of that settlement were subject to legally binding confidentiality agreement. We are therefore unable to confirm whether any specific individual received such a settlement.
It's reported that Jamal al-Harith has died in a suicide attack in Mosul, and doing so has killed several others on behalf of a barbaric extremist regime. If these reports are correct, he was a deeply dangerous man involved in the worst kind of extremism and terrorism that I'm sure would be widely condemned on all sides of this House. Everyone understands there will be information that cannot be revealed because of intelligence reasons. However, he has provided far too little information about such a serious case. Can he confirm whether Mr al-Harith was made any payment? And also, notwithstanding the subsequent welcome legislation which had cross-party support to tighten the law, would he agree that people across the country will feel sickened at the idea of large payments being made to someone who may have been involved in serious terrorist activity? We know that Mr al-Harith was subject to monitoring after 2004. Was he subject to monitoring between 2010, when the compensation payments are reported to have been made, and reportedly leaving the country in 2014?
Can I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her questions? And, well, can I also just say, like her and like my constituents, we will be outraged and disappointed by the sums of money that have been paid. But the sums of money that have been paid and been reported to have been paid, I can't comment on the individual cases, and unlike former Home Secretaries, the government is bound by its legal obligations that it has made, and we cannot break those legal commitments. But I can say that some of the vulnerability that led us to have to pay those damages occurred when she was a member of the Labour government, and when those individuals brought claims against us.
There will be natural public concern about the case of Jamal al-Harith, who was allegedly paid £1 million in compensation by the UK government following his incarceration in Guantanamo. And there will be natural public concern that the Minister has chosen to hide behind the notion of sensitive intelligence to fail to answer even the simplest factual questions about this case. So I repeat, was there any payment? We don't need to know exactly how much, but was there any payment? Is there any truth in the idea that the settlement was designed to stop al-Harith making embarrassing revelations about our acquiescence and enabling of the torture of a UK citizen.
It is reported that around £20 million has been paid to former Guantanamo Bay detainees, 16 in number. This morning, Lord Blunkett suggested that that sum should be formally reviewed, since the public will be dismayed and they'll be particularly concerned if any of that money has gone to fund terrorism. Will he undertake to review the £20 million or thereabouts that is reported to have been paid out to these individuals?
My right honourable friend raises an important point about the destination of what happens with any money paid to individuals. And one of the reasons we took through the House only on Tuesday the Criminal Finance Bill, which covers terrorist financing, is to give us even more powers to track money destined for terrorism and to deal with it.
The root cause of the problem here is the operation of the detention camp at Guantanamo. The government previously supported President Obama's aspiration to see it closed and the reduction in the numbers there. The current president, when he was campaigning, said he was going to load it up with some bad dudes. Does the government now support President Obama's position or President Trump's?
Minister.
I think before the government comments on United States actions, you should see actually what the actions are in themselves. What I can tell you from my own personal experience as a young officer in Northern Ireland doing counter-terrorism is torture, degrading people, doesn't work, it doesn't get you the results you want, and in fact it usually extends conflict.
Can I disassociate myself from these disgraceful attacks on the Tory benches on the Daily Mail for campaigning to release British subjects from Guantanamo Bay? Lord Carlisle was a government advisor. He has stated that Jamal al-Harith and others were paid compensation to prevent the release of security information through the courts into the public domain. It's a bit late for the Minister now to rest on confidentiality, so perhaps you could tell us this. What was the date of the confidentiality clause which the Minister was citing? Or is that too confidential? Minister.
First of all, perhaps I could respond to the Right Honourable Gentleman's point about the attacks on the Daily Mail. I don't think anyone's heard from this dispatch box an attack on the Daily Mail, and I know he'd like to put up a straw man to make some allegations. As I said in my answer, November 2010, we made a legally binding confidentiality agreement. The key word in there for him is legally binding. It's not confidential, it's the legally binding bit, which I'm sure he will understand puts an obligation on us. It doesn't put an obligation on former Home Secretaries, by the sounds of things, or reviewers of terrorism, but on this government, and should it be even an SNP government, they would be legally obliged to stick to the confidentiality agreement, and he knows it.
The government has come under pressure to take urgent action over investigations into allegations against British veterans who served in Northern Ireland. Some Conservatives and Democratic Unionist MPs have said that in future, inquiry should only proceed if new evidence is uncovered. The demands follow the decision by the Defence Secretary, Sir Michael Fallon, to shut down the Iraq Historic Allegations Team.
We believe that the government must give urgent consideration to introducing a statute of limitations for soldiers and police officers who face the prospect of prosecution in cases which, and this is very important, in cases which have previously been the subject of full police investigations. It is wrong that our veterans are sitting at home wondering if perhaps a third or a fourth investigation is now going to take place into their case simply because some hot, fast-thinking, make a quick buck human rights lawyer in Belfast thinks it's a good idea to reopen this case. And that's what's going on. That's what's going on here.
To reopen cases now, Madam Deputy Speaker, what it does, it's revisionism. It's trying to rewrite history. We're trying to look at what happened then through the lens of 2017, where we have a whole new emphasis on human rights and different standards. I find this perverse, wrong, and completely unacceptable.
I am increasingly worried because 38 years ago, I gave my word to two men under my command after they had been involved in a fatality shooting that if they went to court and were charged with manslaughter and they were proved not guilty, they would never hear anything again. I gave my word, and it looks like My word may not be worth a fig if this continues.
I'm grateful to my honourable and gallant friend, but I think a lot of us share on this side of the House the view that fresh evidence, a transparent procedure for showing that fresh evidence has emerged, should be the requirement for any of these cases to go forward.
There cannot be a progress to the future without a complete settlement of the issues of the past. There has to be the closure, there has to be the investigation, there has to be the disinfectant of sunlight, to quote the phrase. We have to move on, sure and certain in the knowledge that we have done everything to investigate the past.
We will never accept any kind of moral equivalence between those who sought to uphold the rule of law and terrorists who sought to destroy it. For us, politically motivated violence in Northern Ireland was never justified, whether it was carried out by Republicans or Loyalists.
The Northern Ireland Secretary called on all parties following next week's elections to the Northern Ireland Assembly to get behind the 2014 Stormont House Agreement and the plans to set up a historical investigations unit.
Any legislation establishing the HIU would include specific tests which must be met in order that a previously completed case is reopened for investigation. This will mean specifically that new and credible evidence that was not previously available to the authorities is needed before the HIU will reopen any closed case.
I would hope that on the far side of this election, that there is that opportunity for the restoration of the political institutions and that there's parallel negotiations to deal with these issues that are outstanding, that seem to drag us down.
It's absolutely important that the institutions which were being set up under the Stormont House Agreement, which the Secretary of State referred to and which my right honourable friend referred to, the Historical Investigation Unit and so on, are set up so that we can have a balanced, fair and proportionate approach to all of this.
On Monday, the Prime Minister Theresa May turned up in the House of Lords to watch the start of the debate on the bill authorising the government to trigger the start of the UK's departure from the EU. It's extremely rare for a Prime Minister to observe proceedings in the upper chamber. A Labour MP, Valerie Vaz, was suspicious about the reasons for the trip.
This is a photo opportunity Prime Minister and government. All photos, no substance or any thought for the British people. Not content with being the first to visit the United States, when the Prime Minister should have been networking in Europe, the Prime Minister then photobombs the House of Lords in the company of the Leader of the House. No wonder we can't get a date for recess. Instead of photobombing, the Prime Minister needs to focus on what's going on in her own cabinet. She may have come off the sofa and into the cabinet table, but she needs to have a discussion with them. They are completely out of control.
I was disappointed by what the Honourable Lady said about the House of Lords. And I actually think it's important. It's important that ministers respect the constitutional role of the House of Lords. In my experience, both in government and in opposition, members of the other place like the fact that ministers and indeed occasionally opposition spokesmen go and listen to what they have to say, and that is exactly what my right honourable friend the Prime Minister and I were doing earlier in the week.
Well, I suppose the Leader of the House can safely put away that abolition of the Lords Bill then, and all we really needed was a selfie with himself and the Prime Minister when he visited the Chamber last week. After threatening to lead this great Brexit rebellion, these brave tribunes in Ermine have only led the nation all the way to the top of the Woolsack Hill and all the way back down again, well, obviously leaving the taxi motor running. And on that, am I the only member of this House that's slightly disturbed about these allegations from the former Lord Speaker? I mean, this is taxpayers' money. Surely, does the Leader of the House not agree that this at least warrants some sort of investigation about what's going on down there with their expenses?
He was referring to claims made in a BBC programme on the House of Lords, due to be aired next Tuesday. The former Leader of the Lords says some peers turn up briefly just to claim their £300 allowance.
While I don't know any detail beyond the reports of this television programme, it's clearly right that evidence about specific allegations needs to be investigated by the appropriate authorities in that House, just as should be the case in this House. But there has also to be due process, and one has to proceed on the basis of evidence and not just allegation.
You're watching Thursday in Parliament with me, Christina Cooper. New figures show net migration has fallen to its lowest level for 2 years, but it's still above the government's target. It dropped to 273,000 in the year to September, down 49,000 on the previous 12 months. The Home Secretary said the numbers showed that we can reduce migration where we can control it. Just as those figures were being released, the Lords Economic Affairs Committee was holding its latest hearing into Brexit and the labour market.
I would suggest an objective of this kind, a level of net migration that avoids undue pressure on our population, public services and community cohesion. Do we need a target? I would say yes. Finally, as for an appropriate level, that of course is a key question. I would say that even 100,000 a year would add about 9 million to our population over the next 25 years. So if your concern is population crowding and everything that follows from that, then you should be having in mind something of that order.
The net migration target is a nonsense. I mean, it's absurd because there's no right level of net migration. It's absurd because the government doesn't have the means to achieve any arbitrary target that it sets, both because it scarcely controls emigration or EU migration, and because it only has limited control over non-EU migration. And last but not least, and crucially, because in prioritising an absurd and arbitrary target, it takes stupid and costly decisions without thinking through the consequences. So it's madness at a time when every country on the world is trying to increase its share of a booming global export market to be clamping down on foreign students.
Basically, what you're advocating is a complete free-for-all, that anyone who's got a job should be able to get a visa to come here. And you say, in response to the point that's been made by Lord Green about the public backlash that might result, is that this could be dealt with by making welfare benefits less available. The problem we have is that people can't get GPs appointments, the National Health Service is under enormous pressure, there's huge opposition to building on the Greenbelt. I mean, isn't this an idealistic economic model which is completely impractical?
The self-selected migrants who are able to come to Britain freely tend to be particularly highly educated, are more likely to be employed, and are particularly large net contributors to public finances. In effect, actually, they're subsidising the public services of British people. If there were no migrants here, there'd be even less money for net for public services for British people. Well, not to mention, no doctors and far fewer doctors and nurses to care for them.
A Liberal Democrat asked about sectors such as agriculture that relied on large amounts of low-skilled migrant workers.
You're saying that we should aim ultimately to be self-sufficient then in that sense,
in
not
most
relying
sectors,
on
yes. Well, I mean, we have 1.5 million people who are unemployed, and we have over 1 million part-time workers who are looking for full-time work. So it's not as if the barrel is empty.
I mean, self-sufficiency is clearly feasible. Robinson Crusoe scraped by on his island. But the idea that it's desirable is insane. Economies are flexible, they adjust. Just as if we tried to become self-sufficient in goods and services, we would adjust. We'd be poorer, but we'd adjust. Mechanisation clearly is one thing that would happen. Some things we would just do without. So the Scottish strawberries that Lord Forsyth loves would go unpicked, and so perhaps with the English strawberries, and we would import Spanish strawberries instead. Whether British people would be better off as a result or not, I doubt it. I'm just kind of speechless.
Now, with some 100,000 people facing starvation and 1 million more on the brink of famine in South Sudan, an independent peer, Lord Alton, secured an urgent question in the House of Lords. He wanted to know what was being done to tackle the causes of the crisis in the country.
Does the noble lord agree that the 3-year civil war in South Sudan and the continuing conflict just north in South Kordofan and Blue Nile in the Republic of Sudan have generated vast numbers of refugees and a consequential inability to grow and harvest crops, and that should remain our priority in combating this man-made famine? Can the noble lord tell us what progress is being made in achieving this, in obtaining access to closed areas in the unity state, and in galvanising international efforts to save the lives of millions now at risk of starvation, malnutrition and famine?
He's absolutely right in highlighting that many of the crises that we face are not man-made, but this one is most certainly man-made. I've just left an emergency planning meeting with coordinating partners on the situation in Somalia, where some 6 million people are at risk because of famine. And there we are doing the best that we actually can. Here, the frustrating thing is that although we've committed £100 million, although the UN mission to South Sudan is in place on the ground, and many humanitarian workers are risking their lives to deliver aid, unless there is that peace agreement, the implementation of the existing peace agreement, then the futures of the people in South Sudan, particularly women and children, are looking increasingly bleak.
What are we doing in terms of building sustainable peace efforts, building trade? Comes back to our point before. Development is not just about humanitarian aid, it is about building peace and sustainability, particularly in Africa.
The Noble Lord's absolutely right, and I appreciate his remarks. On the specifics that he mentions, we have been supporting and encouraging the work of the Intergovernmental African Development Body, IGAD, who have been leading a lot of this work, and also through the UN Security Council on that. We've been working with international partners. We're part of a troika with Norway and the United States that have been key in intervening in this area.
A huge amount had been done, he said, but the UK could not do it alone. Now, what will airports be like in the post-Brexit world when the UK takes control of its borders? Will there be long queues of people from EU countries waiting to get through passport checks? Perhaps there'll be a new dedicated fast lane for British passport holders.
Does taking back control of our borders mean that 23 million inbound passengers from the EU who pass through our airports each year will be subject to full border checks? Is he aware of research from the Transport and the Tourism Industry Council which shows this would require UK Border Force resources to be increased by 200%? And can you assure us those costs won't be met from the 350 million he promised to the NHS each week?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is already the case that when an EU citizen arrives in this country, they have to show their passport, and I don't envisage that changing in the future.
Passengers arriving at UK airports are expected to queue for no longer than 25 minutes coming from the European Economic Area and 45 minutes coming from outside that area due to service-level agreements between the government and the airports. Does the Secretary of State believe that these service-level agreements will need to be revised post-Brexit?
Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister said recently, and I would reiterate, our desire post-Brexit is not to have long queues at our borders, but to actually have sensible arrangements that allow people to travel, to do business, but also to enable us to have the controls on migration to the United Kingdom that I think the people voted for last year.
Mr. David Nuttall. Does my right honourable friend agree that once the UK leaves the EU, we will be free to open dedicated entry lanes at our airports for use only by UK citizens and those of our overseas territories, thereby speeding up entry to the UK?
Well, of course, Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend knows, it will, post-Brexit, be a matter for this House and this government to decide how best to manage our borders. But I'm sure my honourable friend would wish to ensure that where appropriate we have the smoothest possible passage through our borders for people who would wish to welcome to our country.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee this week, several witnesses expressed concern about the timeliness that would be required for considerable physical reconfiguration of airports. Is the Secretary of State having conversations with the airports about these potential scenarios?
Well, I had a meeting, in fact, with airlines and airports earlier this week, and will continue to do so, and we will continue to consult carefully with the industry. But as I say, of course, people arriving from all around the world today have to show their passports already when they arrive in the United Kingdom, so I don't envisage the kind of dramatic change that perhaps some are suggesting.
What assurances and evidence can you provide that is interdepartmental work ongoing to ensure that there will be as little disruption as possible and ensure our tourism market, which is vital for jobs and the economy, will not be adversely affected?
I mean, I simply say to the Honourable Lady, she's making an assumption I simply don't accept. I mean, it is the case already, Mr Speaker, that people arriving at our borders have to show their passports before entering the country. I don't envisage that changing, and we certainly don't envisage a situation where we suddenly create vast additional queues at our borders. We want a smooth, streamlined process for people who have the right to come here to do so and to be welcome here.
Chris Grayling reassuring everyone that there'll be no long queues at airports. Well, time for me to fly, but do join me on Friday night at 11 for a roundup of a week in which the House of Lords got their hands on the Brexit bill. Until then, from me, Christina Cooper, goodbye.